And hello, everyone. Welcome to Coffee, Kegs, in Kriegsspiel. I am your host, Marshall, coming to you from the beautiful central coast of California. Instead of being outside and enjoying the beach on this glorious day, I am here doing a podcast because actually, I love it. Want to say hello to everyone who's here. We got Achilles here, and I think Tack is here. He and I are going to talk about the travails of game design. I don't know if we can hear him. Tack, are you there? Can you hear me?
I'm here. I'm just being quiet at the moment.
Okay, let me know when you're ready. But everybody, hello. You're taking a look at our red versus blue map. This is now a dated version. I have updated it since, and I'm going to be doing some more updates. But this is one of the big campaign games that we got running right now. We are now about 4 months into the game, and this may be one of the more complicated games that we've managed to develop and run. It's got an economic system, it has a military system, and so on. And every time I turn around, the players are trying to add another layer of what I call minutia to the game. And the problem
No
with
idea what
minutia,
you're talking about.
right, right, that's right. Tak here is one of the players. He plays this little pink country right here. Um, but yeah, it's you know, I like to bring up the example of Campaign for North Africa, which most gamers have heard of, and if you know about it, it is the most complex board game ever devised. And if you want to know how many people play it, the answer, I'll tell you the answer right now, it's zero. Nobody ever plays it. There are people who have claimed to play it. There are also people who claim to have seen Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. And the fact of the matter is, nobody plays it because it is so incredibly complex. On the other hand, you think of a game like, checkers. Everybody plays checkers. Everybody's played checkers at some point or another because it's so simple. It's actually a deep game, but it's relatively simple. And so there's a spectrum between, tic-tac-toe, checkers, and Connect 4, chess, and, Campaign for North Africa. And where you put your game design is going to determine how many people can access it, meaning how many people can play it, and whether or not it plays to completion. There are a lot of games that never play to completion. You can even think of a simple game like Monopoly, where it gets out of hand quickly because people don't play by the rules and so on, or they don't know the rules, they confuse them, or they add additional layers of minutia. They make up their house rules for the game, and then it ends up in a fight, and the game never finishes. And you can easily end up in that situation with the Kriegsspiel. You can end up with a Kriegsspiel that is so complicated the players don't take their turns, they drop out. The umpires drop out because it's too much grief and headache. The system grinds to a halt. And I know that there's a lot of temptation to model things. People want to model, the fire rate of the weapons. They want to give their commanders characteristics and attributes. They want to model, like, I'm doing an economic system. And within the economic system, well, they want to create a commodities market. There's actually some push for a commodities market in our economic system. And where do you draw the line? Because the more complex you make it, the less likely it is to run and succeed. Anyway, I want to say hello to Achilles, who is on the live chat on YouTube. Hello, Achilles. And I want to give Tack a chance to talk because he actually said, I want to come on and talk about the travails of game design. So, in his mind, he's got a whole spiel. I think it dovetails with what I've had to say, the problem that I basically said. But I'm going to let him speak for himself. You good to go, Tack?
Good to go. Can you
Did,
hear me?
I can hear you. Did you want to host a tabletop or what?
Um, no, given that the game that I would host a tabletop of can't be shown to everybody, I would rather not host that tabletop today.
Okay, no problem.
Um,
I am on red versus blue.
yeah,
I,
red
I
versus blue works just fine because it I know enough about it to dovetail that as well.
okay. Go
Um,
ahead and hop in if you want. It's Kriegsspiel. Password is IKS all lowercase.
Cool. Give me just a second. So while I'm hopping in, I do want to definitely shout out to the to all the people that umpired yesterday.
Hmm.
For a lot of them, that was their first time umpiring anything in World War II, which is a era that inspired me to keep to do this today. And what was that password again, Marshall?
IKS all lowercase.
It's been a while since I've hopped on one of your tabletops. Normally, there's another universal password.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, so one of the things, and it really struck me last night because I kind of after yesterday, I've kind of taken the rest of the weekend to go. I do not want to touch anything regarding a campaign for a couple days because of the amount of time that was put into that
Hmm.
getting that set up. Um, but one thing that definitely wanted to talk about, especially to people that are relatively new to umpiring, or they're relatively new to Kriegsspiel, is a concept, and they want to get into umpiring their own games. Um, just for reference, my experience with Kriegsspiel type games is about 20 years. I've
Hmm.
been doing this since on some level since I was a teenager, back in the days of when you did it on internet forums or play by email. Um, the the thing to keep in mind when you're designing a game is, one, make sure that your scope is something you can do with whatever umpires you have. Get an idea of how many umpires you're going to need, and make sure that you have the umpires to do that scope. Like you said, a lot of people like to get into granular stuff, and the more knowledgeable your player base is about an era or a particular war or campaign, the more granular the detail they're going to get into.
And that
For
that
instance,
yeah. Go ahead.
yep,
That's a huge pitfall I want to go into, but go ahead.
yeah, and it is more and more of a pitfall the more modern something gets. For instance, with Napoleonic warfare, you could argue the barely noticeable rate of fire and or range and accuracy differences between the Baker rifle and a Kentucky rifle.
Hmm.
And players could argue those minutiae, but you can relatively easily squash that in game. Versus if you're going into a World War II, especially World War II naval or air warfare, you start getting into the differences between a Corsair and a Zero in 1944 as and you start having players go, well, these Corsairs in this era would have the 20 millimeter cannon variation, and that you get these minutiae that they take away. At that point, they're just pulling away from the experience of the Kriegsspiel and the whole
Hmm.
point of the Kriegsspiel, and it becomes a video game.
Yeah, and it becomes a trivia game too. And that's one of the big reasons why we don't do historic scenarios or use historic orders of battle. At least I advise against it. We do run historic scenarios and we do use historic orders of battle, but I personally discourage it and I prefer to shy away from it. And the reason is because you're going to get that guy who has read so many books, they're basically a subject matter expert, or at least believe they are, and they absolutely know more about this subject than you ever possibly will. Like they know exactly where the unit was positioned, they know the elevation of the hill it was on, they know the type of weapon, they know the fire rate, they probably know the casualty figures, and they're going to tell you that you're wrong as an umpire. And as an umpire, you're not interested in that because your job is to look at the overall scenario and craft and curate an experience for the players so that they experience the dilemmas of command at a certain level. And you have this guy wanting to say, yeah, but this here, therefore, I should always win, or I should have a better result than what I receive, or historically they did better in this position than what they're doing in this Kriegsspiel. And people have to understand that the umpires cannot model that level of detail without grinding the game or slowing the game down or bringing it to a halt or somehow compromising the experience for everyone. It might be fun for you to have what we call Confederate Space Marines that can go from one end of the board to the other and not get tired and do it all with the bayonet. But the fact of the matter is, that's not the experience. It's not the point of the exercise. And when players keep bringing up these details, it really grinds the gears for the umpires, and it's actually very discouraging for the umpires because they know you're right, but it's not something they're interested in modeling because it really doesn't have that much of a bearing on the experience. So,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely. And when you're designing, especially a new umpire or an umpire that's done a lot of assistant work, but they're new to designing a scenario. Uh, Keep in mind, if you're doing a play-by-post sort of format, you can get into a little more insanity with, for instance, like the red versus blue campaign. It's play-by-post. There's a team of umpires. There is the ability to do a political level and economics and all these other things.
mm-hmm,
There's an American Civil War game that's getting started now that's on that same scale. And in a
right,
play-by-post format with enough umpires, you can make that work.
right,
But even then, you have to. The earlier you temper the expectations of your players to how granular you're going to let them get, the quicker things get settled. If you're a video game designer, you bake in to the video game, this is what the code says. This is as detailed as it gets, and either the players play the game or they don't play the game.
mm-hmm,
When you do a Kriegsspiel, you have to keep in mind you're a human dealing with other humans, and it is the absolute natural tendency of any person that plays this type of game to want to get as much detail as humanly possible.
mm-hmm,
And going in a larger game setting, such as for instance with I happen to be the Obermeister Derg of the nation of Fior, which is basically short version the Knights Templar, but they somehow didn't get Templared in the Middle Ages, um, and they have managed to survive by not being jerks. So yeah, Marshall gives me a lot of reign with lore, but within the scope of the game, I know my limitations and my constraints.
mm-hmm.
And if Marshall let me get away with it, we would be getting deeper and deeper into granularity. But
Yeah,
by firmly setting, okay, this is the point that we're going to that this is the hill that as an umpire I'm going to die on, that you are not taking me onto this hill. That's where you go ahead and temper those expectations. For new umpires, it is really so easy to get, even in a simple game, a simple Kriegspiel. You have you have your blocks. It's Napoleonic, so regiments are regiments, and they would operate as regiments. It is extremely easy for players to go, well, I would like to deploy this regiment as skirmishers, I like to deploy this regiment to refuse the right flank, and this regiment is going to deploy in square in case the cavalry on the left flank charges.
right,
And
right.
it's very easy for players to say, oh, I like to do this. As an umpire, this causes you to want to commit war crimes.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. No,
So you have to go ahead and firmly set. Don't be afraid as an umpire to say no. And if it's your first outing as a lead umpire, make sure you tell your assistant umpires, this is where we're not going to go. And if you make a judgment call that you're not going to that you tell a player that's not something we're going to try to model, then
yeah,
you're going to back that assistant umpire and say we're not modeling that.
yeah. I put some core markers on the map, And the reason I have done so is to illustrate for people the level of detail that we're going to go into when it comes time for war in this game, in this world, which is core level. You know, you're going to have a core or maybe a smaller, you might have a couple divisions, but it's really just going to be this. This unit's going to hit this unit, and then we have an umpire whose sole purpose for existence is to resolve this. Meaning, because the players play as heads of state, they don't play as individual army commanders. There may be a player who, basically directs the corps to go here or here, but at the end of the day, you're not going to sit there and fight this battle in detail. We do have an umpire who will resolve it. He has a fairly complex method for resolving it, actually. But we're not going to go into that because we don't want the players to know the rules or game the system. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is what you're going to see and this is what you're going to get. You're going to get a result. And at the end of that result, they're just going to say, hey, this unit retreated here. And that's the end of it. And that's going to disappoint people who want to get in and play a game. Now, if we have a particularly big battle where you got a couple of these, and you got these two here, and it's an interesting scenario, like they're fighting right there. Well, yeah, we might actually grab an open Saturday slot and game it out live in real time where players are pushing little stacks of individual blocks. We would love to do that, but we won't be able to do that all the time. And the reason is very simple. If we did this all the time, if we went and we had a full scale game, just getting people around the table is a huge delay. And then, of course, doing this all the time, we would never get through the campaign. So yeah, you have to draw a line somewhere and say this is what we're going to emphasize. And as a result, these things are going to be abstracted. So in this case, we're abstracting some of the combat. Critical battles will be played in real time, but that's something you're doing in your Guadalcanal campaign, right?
That is something. So with when I sat down and said I want to do Operation Watchtower, the first thing I did was figure out the scope I wanted to go and how granular I was willing to deal with. A lot of it was going to be play by post. So we were in the middle of Carter's amazing, massive, and um, mind blowing D-Day campaign that drove some of its umpires to absolute distraction, and I like to joke drove Carter to leave the United States and go to the Pacific for half the game. So the I knew that the Guadalcanal campaign is smaller in general, but it could be played much more granular,
Hmm.
and decided against the much more granular part. The other thing I decided was that I didn't want to deal with some of the issues that Carter had in the initial phases of the D-Day campaign, which was the surprise and trying to make that shock happen in a play-by-post. You can't really do that. So the initial landings were done yesterday as an open Saturday live.
Hmm.
Um, I will say that was I will say it was a qualified success. I was hoping to get through 12 turns in a normal open Saturday
Hmm.
time space, which we kept the time within that, but we only got through 10 turns. So it's a qualified success, but even in that, I realized there were some levels of granularity. One thing I would caution anybody that is starting to umpire or run some games on the Napoleonic Civil War pike and shot type eras first, because those are wars in one dimension.
Hmm.
You only have a land warfare component that's really going at that one time. Or if you run a Age of Fighting sail, you only have a sea component.
Right.
One thing that people love to ask, hey, are we running a World War II? Are we running modern? And you will not see me run a modern game outside of maybe company scale. And the reason for that is modern warfare is run in 4 and 5 dimensions at once. Um, Napoleonic Civil War is kind of the last time that you get this. Some Franco-Prussian is in that same vein, where the war is only in the one dimension of ground combat, and you only have to worry about moving blocks around a map. They're still operating in formations. Fortifications are kind of field fortifications in the way that we think of them today, with foxholes and trenches literally appearing within hours of a unit stopping forward motion organically.
Mm-hmm.
That stuff starts to go away. It's not much of a problem in those earlier time settings. You
Yeah.
would order a unit to dig in. If you didn't order a unit to dig in, it might not dig in on its own. And there's a lot of those. There's a lot of things that simplify it for the umpire. Um, the issue that I ran into yesterday's game was we have ground combat, and my umpire team was very good with ground combat. They handled ground combat amazingly, ground movement amazingly. Then we started to get into air support, indirect fire artillery. I ended up having to reconfigure the rules for indirect fire artillery because they weren't yielding realistic results.
Mm-hmm.
So I reconfigured some rules there to make them to make the results be realistic, because they were just, it was not workable in its initial format.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happens when you have rules that you're still beta testing.
Right.
Um,
Well, Kriegsspiel is the land of fudge. I think I
it
even
is.
heard you say that yesterday.
It is. And the more what you run into, if you want to umpire an experience in a more complex time period, and the more modern it gets, the more complex it gets, is you have to remember you cannot use hard and fast rules.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for Napoleonic combat, you can go, and I'm reaching back a couple of years because we've generally gone beyond it and we've improved upon it substantially. But the original Brigade Kriegsspiel rules,
Yeah.
they're perfectly functional for two corps versus two corps Napoleonic combat.
Right.
They and with those rules, everything is just about hard and fast. You can treat those rules as rigid and get
Mm-hmm.
a good experience for the players. But when you go into World War II combat, I consider that to be dice regulated free Kriegspiel. The dice are there to prevent the umpire bias from kicking in.
Right.
Um, it wasn't a factor in yesterday's game, but had that game been the First Marine Division making landfall, um, as a Marine who specialized in amphibious warfare in my time in the Corps, obviously I would have had certain biases,
Right.
and the dice would have been there to prevent my biases from showing
Right.
during the landings. So that's that. And when you're designing any sort of system, that's another thing you have to keep in mind, is the dice are there to regulate your biases.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's I think to distill this all down is the first point, because there's a couple points here, but the first important point is you have to limit complexity in order to make the game accessible and manageable. And again, players are going to push that envelope. They're going to say, well, can we model this weapon type? Can we start tracking ammunition? Can we track casualties and stuff? In fact, some players show up expecting that you're going to do that. But remember, the closer you get to campaign for North Africa type minutia, the less likely the game is going to be a success. So if you're starting out for the first time, you probably want to keep it childishly simple. Again, like the brigade system that we used early on, or even SoCal Kriegspiel, which is just about as simple as it gets, which we used to use prior to the founding of the IKS. The other thing is, as you get more umpires and you get more experience, then you can become more complex. But also remember, complexity trades off with time. So the more complex the game is, the more time you need. That's why, for example, red versus blue, which is what you're looking at here, can only be played by post. We cannot play this campaign in real time because there are so many different things. Each nation has a cabinet, basically, so there's all these ministers, and all of the ministers have to make their decisions and recommendations, and there's all these meetings that happen. And at the end of all that, the best we can do, the fastest I think we can move, is about 1 week turns, which is what we're on right now. So, yeah, you definitely have to keep it managed. Then I think maybe there might be a third point here where you talk about, that kind of that fudge factor, but the dice. So the dice kind of, limit things to what we would call a stochastic range of probabilities. And that's important. So people understand the big word stochastic. That means a predictable range of outcomes. That's what that word refers to in mathematics or in probabilities or whatever. And um, at the end of the day, though, if you roll a die and the die consistently produces an unrealistic result, like that's just a ridiculous result, and you as an umpire like that's actually scenario breaking, then the reason why we have human umpires is you just rotate that die in the direction of believability, but only insofar as you enter that stochastic range of, okay, that's plausible. Unlikely, but plausible, so we're going to go ahead and call it. For example, let's say TAC is running Guadalcanal and a Japanese torpedo bomber gets through. According to the dice, he gets through the fighter screen, he gets through the flak, he gets through everything, he launches the torpedo hits, the torpedo's not a dead, and that one torpedo sinks an aircraft carrier. What? That is, kind of outside that stochastic range. Is it probable? Probably not. And in that case, he might rotate that die to say, well, the carrier's just damaged. Maybe it's a critical hit and the carrier's going to have to return to port. Maybe it's out of service. But we've never heard of an aircraft carrier being sunk by one torpedo. But what do you do if he rolls a 20, a 20, a 20, a 20, or a 6, a 6, a 6? And go
Marshall,
ahead.
and this is where
Yeah.
I was actually going to use a slightly different naval example, but a real life one.
Mm-hmm.
This is where you do have you have to keep in mind as an umpire, if you have rules like, for instance, the artillery rules were providing completely unrealistic results
Mm-hmm.
consistently.
Yeah.
Therefore, they got modified to provide more realistic results. Um,
Right.
but for instance, if I had my aircraft rules, there was one time where they provided unrealistic results. However, in the previous instances, in both testing and in game, they have provided realistic results for realistic inputs. Therefore, I didn't fudge the results at all. That's something to keep in mind. If on average your rule set is providing consistent historical results for across the board, then those outliers, as an umpire, you have to check your own bias. That, man, that's not realistic. That this unit of guards infantry stepped into the line and they got broken immediately.
Mm-hmm.
That's not realistic. Well, it did happen. It was just rare. And as long as the rules that you have show that it happens rarely, that's fine. If you asked any single member of the British or German Admiralty in 1939 if they thought that the KMS Bismarck would one shot Hood for all practical purposes
Yeah.
on with a very limited number of salvos in a running battle with an off angle shot and everything not being perfectly aligned in its favor, they would have all said, no, that's not going to happen.
Right.
They would
Right.
have looked back at Jutland, they've looked back at other times and said, unless the ship is doing something really dumb or you have bad propellant issues or something awful,
Yeah.
you're not going to get that. But the Golden BB happened.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it's about time for us to wrap
Yep.
up, Tack. Did you have any final comments or remarks at all?
I don't really have any final remarks. I will say that definitely don't be discouraged to create a game.
Mm-hmm.
Just make sure you temper your expectations as an umpire. Make sure you temper player expectations early. And as long as the rules you're using provide consistent results do not be afraid to tell a player, one torpedo bomber came out of the blue and blew your ship up, or
Yeah.
your famed your famed guards cuirassier uh, unit led by General Sam Miller charged onto the field and was immediately routed by militia. If it
Yeah.
happens, it happens. Sometimes it does.
Yeah, sometimes it does. All right, before we leave, I'm going to leave everybody with one of these outlier examples. I remember yesterday we had a player, his name was Dookie, and he was leading from the front. And anytime a player does that, we generally give them a little bit of a bonus, but you also roll a die to determine their fate. And in this case, I happened to be interviewing him when his fate came due, and so let's just listen in here if it plays.
My teammates want to hold position. I argued for a more engaged defense, but they want to go for a passive defense of the river.
Okay. Looks like your umpire's here, so after your umpire leaves, we'll talk about your plans for when you get back home to your family. Go ahead.
Well, actual Marshal, you can stay here because Colonel Dookie, as you are running under artillery fire and hail of gunfire along the front lines of your men, you hear a sudden sharp whistle, and then your whole world goes blank. It seems like you've been shot by an American artillery shell.
So I'm dead.
Yes, you're dead, so you can.
I mean, my
Well, there you go. All right, so yeah, sometimes the golden BB does happen, and what do you do? All right, Tack, I want to thank you for coming on. Thank you, Otto's here. Achilles says real quick the delta between what usually happens and what could possibly happen is pretty wide. I want to thank Jan for being here and for keeping the live stream clean of spam. And I'm just going to say, that's not my bag, baby, if anyone gets that reference. And I don't think you guys can see the comments that have come through, but we had a couple spam bots. But anyway, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Otto. Yes, you are famous now, Otto. That's probably my favorite clip. I've listened to it like half a dozen times. I think it's a fantastic Kriegsspiel moment. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I just want to say we will see you